This is Module 16, Part 2, Ways to Monitor Progress. In this section, we'll go over the various tools and types of assessments used for progress monitoring. Let's begin with some general rules for progress monitoring. The frequency of progress monitoring depends on each student and their IEP goals, as well as instructional and programming goals. For example, students in an emotional support program may have specialized behavior plans that need to be monitored weekly. Other students may have data collected bi-weekly or monthly. Another general rule is that there is lots of data to be collected and evaluated through progress monitoring. Many students with IEPs may receive progress monitoring in more than one area if they have academic, behavioral, and functional IEP goals. Students who receive related services such as speech therapy, occupational therapy, physical therapy, social work services, etc., will also receive progress monitoring in those settings as well. Depending on your role as a paraprofessional, you may be part of that data collection process as well. This graphic describes effective progress monitoring. Knowing that many students will need to be progress monitored in several areas, and that teachers may have many students on their roster to progress monitor, it must be an efficient and effective process. Therefore, progress monitoring should measure the goal in the IEP quickly and efficiently. The data collected should be equivalent each time, which means it is the same type of data collected repeatedly. As stated previously, it's important that the data is collected regularly and on a certain schedule. To be sure that the student's needs are being addressed, this should be done frequently. And it's important that it's easy to implement and takes just a short time away from instruction and other activities within the classroom. Progress monitoring should also be consistent and should allow for the IEP team to analyze the student's performance over time. This table shows some examples of progress monitoring tools that have proven to be both effective and efficient. Let's take a look at these types. The first type of progress monitoring tool is work samples. This is when a teacher uses samples of the student's current work to monitor progress. For example, handwriting samples would be used to monitor progress on a handwriting goal. This could be printing or cursive. Another tool is teacher-created assessments or curriculum-based measures. This includes things like worksheets made from generators. Good examples of this are math fluency generators to work on addition or multiplication facts, or oral reading passages that would assess words correctly read per minute. This could also include worksheets that come from reading or math programs, weekly spelling tests, and pre and post tests that could be created by teachers. Checklists and frequency charts are another type of tool that are often used to monitor student progress. These are most often used for students who are working on functional skills, such as hand washing or making meals, but they can also be used to monitor behavioral goals like calling out in class or staying on task. Finally, norm reference assessments are also used often to monitor progress. These products are specifically purchased by schools to progress monitor. Many of these are now computer-based programs and are usually done very quickly and efficiently, sometimes in just 1-minute probes. Now we're going to look at several examples of progress monitoring tools. This first one is a reading goal example. As you can see on the left, this is Eddie, and he has a reading goal. Given 2 to 4 syllable words, Eddie will identify by clapping the number of syllables in words presented orally with 90% accuracy on 3 consecutive probes. On the right, we see the tool that is used to collect the data. So Eddie is being monitored on his ability to identify syllables in words. As you can see, the form is designed to be both effective and efficient. Several days worth of data can be collected on the same form, and both Eddie and another classmate's data can be collected on the same form. Also, the form collects data on 3 different syllable types. So overall, this is a very easy way to collect reading data for 2 students on 3 days, and it shows 3 different skills for each student. Collecting data on this form is also very easy because it's just a plus or minus. So if the student correctly claps the number of syllables, the teacher would circle the plus sign. If the student incorrectly clapped the number of syllables, the teacher would simply circle the minus sign. Let's look at another example. This one would be an example of a teacher-created assessment or a curriculum-based tool. And this is a math progress monitoring example. This is a mixed practice sheet that reviews several different types of math concepts. Notice that the worksheet is brief with only a few questions and could be scored very quickly by the teacher. If there were several students in the class who had the same math goal, the teacher could hand out the same form and very quickly score these for each of the students and come up with a score. As a paraprofessional, you might be asked to hand these out and simply watch the students complete the progress monitoring paper. On this slide, we see an example of a student-led progress monitoring form. Often, it is advantageous for students to be involved in their progress monitoring so they can see their own progress and celebrate their successes. In this example, you can see that the student has been charting their reading fluency progress on different reading passages over several weeks' time. Again, you can see that this is an efficient and effective way to progress monitor because on the same sheet, there have been several passages listed across the bottom. It covers several weeks from February until March, and it does allow the student to have 3 tries on each of the stories. This one is a great example of a student who is making progress because on each of the stories, she scored higher at each time that she tried. So her first score was always the lowest, and she was able to make great gains as she went into her second and third try at each story. So for a teacher who was looking at this progress monitoring checklist, who was looking at this progress monitoring form, for a parent who was looking at this progress monitoring form, and for the student looking at this progress monitoring form, it is very easy to see that the student was making great gains in reading fluency. So this would be a student-led example, and as a paraprofessional, you may be asked to help the student fill in the chart each time she is having her progress monitoring done. Now let's focus on a progress monitoring that's specific to a functional behavior. So in this example, which would most likely be used in life skills classrooms, this would be a checklist that a student could use or also could be used to evaluate a student's progress. And this one would be about toileting or going to the bathroom. So on this one, it is a checklist of the behaviors, the functions that are associated with how you go to the bathroom. So the student would be looking at each of the steps in the process and working to complete these skills independently. A teacher would be able to assess how many of these they were able to do independently, or maybe how many they were able to do without prompting. Again, this is a very efficient and effective way to show the number of skills that a student has mastered with a particular functional skill. Now we're going to turn our focus to progress monitoring for behaviors. So we're going to watch this brief video to learn a little bit more about progress monitoring for behavior.
Why is progress monitoring in behavior important?
To answer that question, you have to first start by talking about behavior and your goals for change around behavior. Behavior is very different than academics, where in academics we might say our goal is to have a child be able to read fluently. In behavior, our targets change substantially and could vary based on intensity, duration, or frequency of the behavior. So for example, you might have a behavior change goal of not getting homework done, or that might be the behavior problem. Or it might be intense yelling out or walking around the classroom inappropriately. So there's no singular behavior target and no singular goal with regard to what you're trying to do with that behavior change. It might be that you're just trying to reduce the variability, so the intensity of that yelling out, or it might be that you're trying to get to 90% of homework done. So when you talk about why is progress monitoring in behavior important, I would argue that progress monitoring is actually the most critical assessment purpose in behavior and behavior change, because the tools that you're picking have to match flexibly to answer those questions around, is behavior changing? And when you mix the is the behavior changing in with what are the supports that I'm putting into place, you're actually answering, is it working for the defined problem?
What information does progress monitoring provide that is different from screening data and diagnostic data?
That answer goes back to having very different purposes of the assessment, or different answers based on what you're asking. When you're asking about behavior screening, you're trying to answer questions about who needs help, or how big is the gap between what we're expecting from a student and what they're actually exhibiting now. When you're asking diagnostic assessment, or that you're getting information that's diagnostic, you're getting information that helps answer why is it occurring and more detail around what's happening in that behavior. Those pieces inform directions for the intervention or the intervention supports that you're going to put in place. In contrast, the progress monitoring data tells us, is it working? When you take all that information, you put it together to try something, you're answering, or you're using data in progress monitoring to say, is it working? And when you're answering if it's working, the progress monitoring data have to be repeatable, so you have to be able to capture it on more than one occasion. You have to know that it's efficient for us to collect, and it has to be defensible. And then returning back to the original point around progress monitoring behavior, it has to be flexible, so our tools have to be able to match behaviors, and they're going to be different based on what is of interest. So if you go back to our original question about yelling out or walking around, yelling out might be an appropriate behavior to do at a football game, right? Or walking around is certainly something that you're looking for if your goals are to increase physical fitness, but it's dependent on the context. Those might not be okay in the general classroom. And the only way that you can say if something is working is if you have progress monitoring. And that's again, the reason why I would say that progress monitoring in behavior, it becomes probably the most critical data source for informing directions of where you're going.
Now that we've learned a little bit more about progress monitoring for behavior, let's look at a few examples. In this example, the goal for John is that he will decrease calling out in class. So to progress monitor that goal, the teacher might decide that during reading class, John will increase raising his hand and waiting to be called on by the teacher to 10 times per day for 5 consecutive days using a frequency count. As a paraprofessional, You may be asked to help complete the frequency chart seen at the bottom of the slide. You would simply be marking down each time during reading class that you observed John raising his hand and waiting to be called on. As we can see in this example, John has not yet met his progress monitoring goal because on some of the days he was not able to make it to 10 times per day. Also, on Wednesday, he was absent. Here's another example of a progress monitoring goal for behavior. On this one, we're looking at Allison. She is going to increase her time spent on task. So her teacher has decided that for her progress monitoring, Allison will increase her time spent on task independently completing assignments to 10 minutes per day for 5 consecutive days by using a duration count. As a paraprofessional, you may be asked to keep a duration log of time spent on task by recording the time that the student begins a task and then recording when the student either completed the task or engages in an off-task behavior. As you can see in the chart below, on Monday, she started on task at 9:07 and spent a good amount of time being on task until she completed at 9:20. On Tuesday, you can see that she was on task briefly, was somehow interrupted, but then was back on task for a little bit longer. Wednesday seems to be a good day. She was able to stay on task. Thursday, she was only briefly on task, and then there is a star and a notation that she went to the nurse. And then Friday was another decent day of being on task. Now, the note on Thursday about leaving to go to the nurse is important information for progress monitoring, as well as the attendance information on the last slide, because that could certainly skew progress monitoring data. And it's also interesting because if you have students who are frequently absent, who are frequently missing class time because of going to the nurse or not being in the room, that certainly affects their ability to meet these progress monitoring goals and their IEP goals in general. So those are all good things that should be documented as part of the progress monitoring process as well. Another important part of progress monitoring for behavior is that oftentimes students have more than one behavior goal that needs to be progress monitored. So in this example, we see several behaviors that have been monitored. And again, when we think about effective and efficient use of time for progress monitoring, we see that on this chart, we have several behaviors monitored over several months' time. And again, when data is displayed visually in graph form, it becomes very easy to see the trends and the behaviors that still need to be worked on. In this specific example, we can see that the student is excelling at being ready for class, following a visual schedule, and packing their backpack. The student still needs work on completing work and keeping their body in check. This example shows how powerful progress monitoring data can be because it shows which skills educators need to focus on and also which successes can be celebrated. This is the end of part 2. Please complete the questions before moving on to part 3.